Hi, everybody. Welcome to the School Community Huddle with Ana Martinez. Today, I am so excited to talk about SEL and race. It's a big topic right now, and I wanted to invite two amazing special guests today. My special guests can introduce themselves, your name, how many years of experience you have, and positions you've held.
I can get started. So I'm Taquita Aguilar. I have been in education for 10 years now. I've been a 5th grade teacher, a 6th grade teacher, a 7th grade teacher, and I like to say I specialize in math and science. I geek out for math for sure. I've also been a math coach at a middle school, and I'm currently a principal.
Hi, everybody. My name is Colin Erhara. Ana, thank you so much for having us. I am in my 7th year teaching English and Ethnic Studies at my school, but I've also just taken on Dean of Students position there. But in education as a whole, I've been started as a after-school educator, have been a case manager, and that has been since 2001. So that's, I think, 19 years. Am I missing anything?
Welcome. I'm so excited to talk about it. Parents, if this is a podcast for you, administrators, this is a podcast for you, educators. I think we can all benefit from just talking about this and diving deep. I think that when we hear the word race, some of us have different reactions. Some of us are like, let's talk about it. And other people are just like, wait a minute, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about this? This is about schools. And it was important for us to talk about SEL and race together because they go hand in hand. So I'm wondering about how is your school preparing for the SEL component, right? Social emotional learning. For families that don't know, social emotional learning, all schools are implementing this, designated and integrated SEL, but in reality, we've been doing it for years, right? You can't teach a little human without SEL. So tell me a little bit about how you are starting to integrate that when it comes to virtual learning.
So we, just knowing the context that we are entering this school year, the fact there are still ongoing protests across our nation, and the fact that the health pandemic has greatly impacted our community and is still impacting our community as we start school. We started this school year, my staff and I, with like home place is our theme. And we took it from Bell Hooks, and we took it from Dr. Bettina Love in her I Want to Do More Than Survive. And we read through both like this idea of home and home place and what it means to establish a home place for students virtually. So recognizing that some of our students, when we talk about home place, it being a place of resistance and strength, some of them, their home is not always their home place. And our building used to be a place where they would literally like cross the threshold into a classroom or, past the school gates, and they would have a home place. And so we talked about what does it mean to start a school year virtually where students are sitting in their homes. And for some of them, it is a home place, and for others, it is not. And so being really intentional around building relationship and building partnership at the start of the school year. And so when I had my team create their 3-week launch into virtual learning, the focus was relationships. I think the other piece is we do have designated SEL at our school site. And I wanted to make sure our SEL programming fit the context. So myself, my assistant principal, got into the current curriculum that we use, and we chose the lessons that we're putting in front of our students. And if it didn't fit the context, then we put something else in its place. And if it didn't talk about race, and if it didn't talk about issues that our students are facing that create the emotions that naturally exist within them, then we took that lesson out and we put something else in. And so the goal is to be really intentional around the type of SEL lesson we put in front of students, but also to make sure that it is authentic. And so we're moving away from this white supremacy is a hug, and that comes from Dina Simmons, and making sure that we're not just like hushing our students. I know you're angry, calm down, and then we're gonna get to this lesson. That we're acknowledging what may have caused that anger, and we're letting them know that that context is real.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, a lot of things were coming to mind as Taquita, as you were sharing. At my school, a lot of our current folks, I think the first thing that comes to mind from what you're saying is really trying to, there's a recent article I read that I really appreciated, where it was called Why We Can't Whitewash SEL, right? And why we can't view social emotional learning, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as something that is being used to bring about complicity, conformity, assimilation in Black and brown young people. And how, and how dehumanizing that is, in identifying and resisting that. So I think, us explicitly talking about that in my school community has been really impactful, at least to begin with. But I think when also thinking about white supremacy culture, and and Tima Okun talks about perfectionism being one tenet, right, of white supremacy culture, that I think we've really been trying to bust this kind of like false binary that I think like a lot of us in this work can internalize unconsciously at times, of like, you are either kind of like you have to be really hard on yourself constantly, or you can't hold yourself accountable. And I think there is a way to like be compassionate, be kind and patient with yourself in this really difficult work, and acknowledge how incredibly challenging it is, while also, working to hold ourselves and each other accountable in the work too. And I think those things like initially come up around SEO, and again, like starting with ourselves as adults in this, and like whether it's using something like a tool like the mood meter, right, where like it describes numbers and colors that help us identify how we're feeling with regards to our energy and our levels of pleasantness or unpleasantness. But like, if we're not able to do that and step into that vulnerability, understanding that like young people, I think it was Cornel West said, young people don't want to hear a sermon, they want to see one. Mm-hmm. And so being able to model those forms of vulnerability before we're, pushing any of our children to do so. But that's what comes to mind, at least initially.
Wow, so good. I want to talk about this word that might have brought a reaction in some people when it was used twice by each of you: white supremacy. Now, this podcast is for everybody. It is all about love. And I think I want to dive deep in. If you're a parent and you're hearing an educator use that term, can you explain to me what you're signifying? Because I think it might be off-putting to folks, white or non-white, that might be like, but I want my kid to not hate white people, and it's not about that. So I want you to talk to me about white supremacy. What do you mean by that? And then when you're talking about whitewashing SEL, what does that mean?
So I think this is something that I've been struggling with as a parent. My daughter is 6, and we've been having conversations around race. And one thing I love about people of color is our compassion, and the fact that we exist in a country that does have a white supremacist culture. And I am raising my child to not hate white people at the same time. And so when I say white supremacy, I think on a simple level, it is me at a bookstore and having to look very hard for a book that represents my child, right? And where if I'm a white parent, I may not have to spend hours finding a book that represents my child. I think it is my child having homework or bringing work home from school where the holidays never represent her history. So I have to be the one to educate my child around her history, because it's not going to happen in schools. And as someone who went through the American education system, I know that this is my norm, right? It's also me being very intentional around uplifting and affirming my kids around their hair texture and their skin complexion and how wide their nose is, because beauty standards don't represent how they look. So when I talk about white supremacy, it is that people of color are always the other. We are never the primary. And so when you teach in communities where it is predominantly people of color, you do have to do extra. Like, you have to build curriculum that reflects them, because you're not going to get a curriculum that reflects their history. And that's just the truth. And for me, it is just a real education around our country's history, so that our students and our kids understand the context to which they're navigating life in this country.
Thank you so much for that. I think a couple things come up to mind for me at the moment. The first is one of the ways that I teach when thinking about the systems of power, oppression, dehumanization, and humanization is thinking about kind of this like this metaphor of like horns and halos, right? And so thinking about the ways that kind of legacies of history, whether in the United States or the world at large, due to colonialism, have kind of some of the impact of that has been to demonize certain people and to kind of deify other people, right? And, you know, all of us, I think, come to our struggles, honestly, like, and when we're born into the world, like, I don't think there's any baby that's born that like wants any, you know, of this dehumanization to take place on either end. But something that I've kind of noticed when talking about white supremacy, particularly in a time when it's growing more and more apparent that like it's a real thing. I think, like, for instance, when Obama was first elected, right, there was, you know, it was like constantly like you had to kind of like engage, if you had the energy, you had to engage with like, you know, folks who were arguing that, you know, that racism is done and there's no more racism, there's no more white supremacy. And so I think, you know, some of the struggle that I kind of found, whether it's, you know, not necessarily just talking to white folks about kind of white supremacy, but also fellow people of color, has been when kind of like using this metaphor of horns and halos, when pointing out that like that white folks like or white culture, I should say, doesn't have a halo around it and isn't perfect. There have been some folks who have felt like they're being demonized, when in fact removing a halo is actually bringing you to the level of being a human being. So I think that's been one challenge. I think the other thing that comes to mind, the second piece is I think it's important because oftentimes just in my life, a lot of people, because of like the way I'm racialized and the way I've looked throughout my life, because I'm like ethnically ambiguous, is naming kind of what my ethnic background. And so my father is a third generation Sansei Japanese American. My grandparents were in the Japanese American internment camps, and that greatly informs kind of my identity in the ways that I view race and see the world. My mother is Scottish German and Haudenosaunee Mohawk. Haudenosaunee is the indigenous word, but Iroquois is the French word that more people are familiar with, the Iroquois League of Nations and things like that. And so the reason I bring those things up is, you know, I think it's really, really important that we name that white supremacy and racism aren't just like ideas or feelings that live inside the heads of people of color, that they are like, you know, they live in like in our experiences. And, you know, to give an example, right? So all of my family members who were incarcerated in the Japanese American concentration camps during World War II lived, or I should say, have died from diabetes, cancer. There has been mental, you know, like alcohol abuse, mental health struggles, and my white relatives have tended to live 10 plus years on average longer than my Japanese American relatives who were interned. Right. So these actual systems and the ways that they play out like actually have you know, negative health outcomes on communities of color. And it's really, really important to name those things.
Mm-hmm. That was good. That made me think about when you're talking about then trying to teach students SEL and race in an intersectionality. Are you teaching them a belief? Because I think parents are worried, right? Like everybody has their values and beliefs from home, right? That's where that's where a lot of it begins. So I want to create or dismiss the misconception that we're force feeding thing to our kids, because that's essentially not what SEL is supposed to be. So I want to explain what is the intersectionality, especially Colin, you're in secondary, Taquita, you are in elementary. How are we teaching SEL and race in schools? Like what would you say is the objective or the intention behind that, especially if you have diverse classrooms with white kids, Asian kids, Indian kids, Black kids, brown kids? Like, how does that look like?
Well, I can jump in real quick because I think when myself included, like when adults, I think, have like this kind of notion that young people, I mean, don't get me wrong, like I think it's really, really important that, young people are taught critical thinking skills from the earliest ages possible. But I also, I think that when I hear, like worry about this, my first reaction is to giggle a little bit, just because, like, as somebody who's worked with young people for so long, like they're so critical, right? They, like, I've never met a young person who just like blindly accepted what I said as truth. Mm-hmm. Young people, I love working with them so much because they challenge me so much, and they just say like, yeah, like, right, where's your proof about that? And so I think like, whenever I hear adults having worries about like young people, and I think especially I'm thinking like teenager lens of them just like blindly accepting what an adult says as the truth. I'm like, I would love to meet these young people you're talking about, because I've never come across a teenager who's been like just blindly accepting what I had to say as truth. And I think, any relative success that I've had as an educator in this work in trying to, support young people in developing critical thinking skills has been, particularly when I model that I am never arrived, that I'm constantly growing, and that like I make mistakes. And I also, when I'm presented with new information, that I can change my opinion as well.
I would say, because this is a struggle for me. Like, it is a struggle for me to teach my own young children about race and help them through the emotions that arise as a result of conversations around race, them knowing who they are, right? And then my kids are biracial. So then that adds another complexity to this race conversation. So I would say when we're talking about SEL, one of the important pieces of SEL is teaching kids to identify their emotions and how to regulate their emotions, right? Unless a child is not watching TV, does not have access to a phone, is not hearing their parents have conversations, they're aware of what's happening in this country. Like, they're aware. And emotions arise, right? So when my 6-year-old who heard about George Floyd knows that a police officer killed a man in broad daylight, she's going to ask me why that happened. And I'm going to have to explain to her why it happened, right? And emotions are going to arise for her as a Black and brown child, but someone who, because of her skin complexion, people are going to say she's, a Black child, right? Emotions are going to arise. And so then it is my job to help her cope. And I'd also say, I'd ask parents, like, what is the youngest age you experienced racism or oppression that you can remember? And for me, it's 7, right? I didn't know what it was at the time. I wish I had, because I could have been given the tools to navigate that experience, and I would have known that it was not my fault. I think when you are a child of color and those things happen and you have no idea about the context in which you exist, there tends to be I did something wrong. And that's not the case. And so for me, it is, we cannot get away from this race conversation if we are trying to do what's best for our kids. Like, we can't. And it's because they're going to experience it. And I'd even say for white kids, you're going to experience it too. And so when that happens, you're going to have an emotional response. We have to support our kids in knowing how to navigate it. And that's why I think there's the integration of SEL and what's going on in our country now around race. I'd also say it's not an idea we are teaching kids. It is, quite frankly, like history that we're teaching kids. We're teaching them what has happened and what is happening. That's it. And once they know what is happening, how do you feel about this? Like we have a lesson around immigration. Immigration is what's happening right now, right? There are lots of issues around immigration. And if I'm a child whose family immigrated to this country, or I immigrated to this country, I'm already having an emotional response. Like, teach me, support me through navigating that. Otherwise, I cannot engage with math content, ELA content, because you are not recognizing my experience. And I think that leads people to think they're crazy. Like, maybe it's just in my head. Maybe this isn't real. And I do not want kids to go through schooling thinking that what they're actually experiencing is not real.
I want to go into that piece. That was so good, both of you. How young is it too young, right? And you said, unless you have your kid sheltered, and let me tell you something, there are parents out there who are sheltering their kids to some extent because they think it's too young. And I want to show, I'm just going to show compassion. I'm going to show them to love everybody. And thank you for doing that. We love that. But why in particular is it important to talk about race and not just with kids of color, right? So like kids of color got to learn about race early because either they've experienced it or they're seeing it or something's happening. And white passing Latinos, right? Or white folks or folks that are just not comfortable with that identity of critical race conversations can opt out. There's a way for you to opt out. And I do believe that there are parents who are just saying, I'm just going to show them to be kind and love. Yes, that is the beginning. But why be intentional about talking about race?
It's hard to know where to begin. So I guess what's coming to mind too, because I think that, something that I've heard working in a number of different schools and districts and communities, is that, I think, and I wonder to what degrees there's, just like the systems that we operate within kind of gravitationally pull us, whether, intentionally, unintentionally, consciously, unconsciously, to center on worrying about the comfort of white people, right? So even when we discuss these things, right, like, something, and it can come up, many, many times throughout my career, like, what about white kids and, what about white families? And, I think by all means, I consider every young person that I come across, in this work, my extended family. And I think that, so there's always going to be this deep level of care no matter what. But I think that something that, I think that we need to be careful of and try to push back against in our society in particular is this, what, I think dominant culture perceives love and care and, kindness as the absence of conflict. And I think that if you're raised working class and or, not a white person in this country, you understand that kind of conflict, or like conflict kind of is like ingrained in like your everyday life. And so, and also, and I say this as somebody who, I just celebrated my 12th year married to my partner, 19 years together, that like we've had so much conflict. And I think that one of the reasons why our kind of partnership is so strong is because we've never believed in kind of this Disneylandish fairy tale that love means there's no conflict. And I think more so, kind of the way that I frame it and think about it and explicitly say this to young people that, like if I perceive that you're doing something that is harmful to yourself and or, anyone in our community, that, you and I are going to have some conflict because I care about you too much to allow that to happen. And also, while also, saying that, I'm not perfect and it may not look exactly the way that like you and or even I hope it will. But I'm going to do my best to muster the courage to try to step in and interrupt if and when I feel like harm is happening, and that conflict to me doesn't mean that I don't love you.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you bringing up this idea of like white people's comfort, because I'd say there are conversations around race that we're willing to engage in, and we're willing to engage in those conversations in school. The other day, my son asked me what the Holocaust was. I didn't teach him that. And I'd say that is a huge incident that was grotesque, that was dehumanizing, and we talk about it often, and there's a never again, right? So I'm curious why people are comfortable having that conversation, but they're not comfortable talking about slavery. I'd also say for white folks who would like an end to racism, and I do think they exist, right? People who are out here willing to do the work. It starts with educating your children and educating your family members, because people of color cannot do this work without white folks. I strongly believe that. Like, we didn't create this problem, and we are not going to be the end to this problem, right? And I want to acknowledge that talking about race is really uncomfortable. And it's also uncomfortable for people of color. Like, I have to explain to my child that they are powerful, that they can do all things. And then I have to explain racism to them. And racism says the opposite. So I have to figure out a way to balance the fact that they exist in a world that is constantly going to tell them they are not enough because of how they look, because of the race they were born into, while also explaining to them that they're powerful, right? And that is not comfortable. And I don't know how to navigate that, but I know that I need to do it. And so going back to this, like kids, they know. And one of the things when Trump it was around the time Trump got elected, and there were a lot of shootings of Black men by the police, right? And at that time, my son I believe he was 7. And I was like, I have to have this conversation with him. And I don't know how to start. I have no idea where to start. Because as a Black woman, I'm still navigating this conversation. I'm still trying to figure it out. And the answer was to start. And so what I did was I looked for books, like children's books, and I just read them to them. The book that I chose was Something Happened in Our Town. And I just waited for them to ask questions. And I asked, how are you feeling? And that was the first conversation, but that enabled us to have more conversations. And so I think we need to give kids more credit.
I appreciate that. I feel like there's this huge push everywhere about improving and increasing our emotional intelligence, right? And everybody, I feel like, could agree on that, right? You can't get a job or keep a job if you don't have the emotional intelligence to work with others, which is part of SEL, self-awareness and building relationships, right? If you think about the competencies. And I think about how is talking about race improving emotional intelligence in kids? And if we say it that way, would people be more comfortable leaning in?
You know, that's such a good question. Because I think what it's making me think of is, I think it's important to first say that, like, so many, scholars of color have been writing about this before Robin DiAngelo, but it made me think of white fragility, right? And like this concept that, like, because of the ways that, systems, set up certain folks to just for, like, their being to be normalized, that if and when criticism comes their way, it can feel like, like fire burning them, right? And I think, like, have to think about this intersectionally, right? Because when talking about, fragility, for instance, like when I'm working with my boys and young men of color, they can be really ready, like, yeah, let's talk about this. And, like, these are the things that I really, really, like, hate, or that make me feel angry or heartbroken. But then also, much like I did at their age, and still do probably unconsciously, have a ton of fragility around, the ways that they, participate in heteronormative, patriarchal kind of, ideology and sexist, thoughts and actions, right? And so I think SEL, is a powerful, when done well, is a powerful kind of recipe to make us less fragile. And stronger in the places that will, develop our social emotional intelligence, allow us to build relationships across difference, which, we're on a pathway to global ecological collapse, rising authoritarian, fascism. Nothing is more important than our relationships and being able to build empathy right now.
I think also talking about race allows kids to, because emotional intelligence is all about recognizing your emotions and the emotions of others, right? And also being able to determine what move to make based on the situation you are in, right? If we take race out of that conversation, when kids are clearly are having an experience as a result of systematic repression, how can they accurately navigate that emotionally if they don't even know what's happening to them, right? And that goes back to, like, I think kids tend to blame themselves when bad things happen. And if you know what's happening in your experience, you're like, wait, this is the correct emotional response. And I understand the emotional response from the adult, because oftentimes it's the adult in a child, not a child in child, right? Especially in elementary school age. So I recognize why this person is having this emotional response, and I can jump into this with an accurate emotional response myself, right? I think it's also a matter of safety, to be honest, with kids. I think about young kids and, even high school. And for me, when I teach my kids about race, it is one, so that they feel affirmed, but two, so that they know how to navigate so they can survive. And so when you gauge somebody's anger, for instance, it's important to know the root of that anger, because then you can appropriately navigate.
I really appreciate that. I'm going to shift this a tiny bit into Black Lives Matter, right? I think a lot of Latinos and Asian folks and other people of color are like, but what about our story? Why are we centering Black lives right now? I know even in my own family, right? Like, I've had people, when I put something on Facebook, respond to it, like, because in all lives matter, and I want us to dive deep into how do we explain that to children, because it's not about a superiority. It is about centering our most vulnerable or our most hurt. And the association of Black is scary, Black is aggressive, Black boys act up, which is why they have the highest suspension rate, highest getting sent out of class rate. So how do you begin explaining? Because you might have a kid respond to your teacher and say, but Miss, all lives matter. My life matters. I'm an immigrant. I matter. So how do we begin having those conversations with kids?
I saw a meme that I've used ever since with students. I've definitely had multiple students, non-Black students of color, ask those very questions. And but the meme essentially is there's a house on fire, and next door to it, there's a house that's not on fire. And the neighbor who is watching this person try to put out the fire of their house, saying, my house matters too. Mm-hmm. I think like that kind of has, stopped folks dead in their tracks to like kind of think about this in a way. And I can't, literally can't imagine how exhausting, heartbreaking, infuriating it is for Black folks to have these conversations. Or it's even like have memes be like a tool that, with a cartoon that is like used to just like, to try to defend their lives and livelihood. But, I think that being able to, have those conversations, and particularly like, what I'll try to do too is like, I'll try to pull those folks aside individually when I can, and have, kind of heart-to-heart talks with them about, first with listening, but then, my general experience has been, when provided with the evidence, that young people, will change their frame of reference, their point of view around how they view it, when they learn more and they acquire more knowledge around, you know, like who Alicia Garza is, Patrice Kahn colors, and like, you know, why they did what they did, you know, doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I'd say the conversation around to be honest, like this conversation, All Lives Matter, really gets to my spirit. And what I say to people is, as a Black woman, it is me explaining my humanity to you. And that's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. But I think two things are coming up. One, I've also seen a similar meme, but it talks about, did all lives matter when this, right? So it's pointing out the facts that we absolutely believe all lives matter. And the history of this country has said Black lives don't. So we are putting our lives at the front because when we give this blanket statement, all, you forget about us. And that's just history, right? And I think the other conversation is anti-Blackness. I say to people who, there are some Black folks who are on this All Lives Matter, which is a whole nother conversation. But to those who are not Black, who say, well, all lives matter, I'd ask them, what is your discomfort around saying Black lives matter? Because if all lives matter, I can say brown lives matter. I can say indigenous lives. I can say whose ever lives matter, right? I literally took all lives matter and then just made it a little bit more specific. That's it. Like, what is your discomfort around saying Black lives matter? And I think it goes to anti-Blackness, to be honest. For kids, I think it's knowing your history and knowing why Black lives are at the front, right? And it can be as simple as, well, what just happened in our country? Like, who died publicly in the street? It was a Black man. Who is killed disproportionately by the police? Who's incarcerated more, right? Why are literacy rates so low for Black people, Black kids in this country? So when you talk about the history of this country and where we presently are, who is the most oppressed? And I think right now kids can't answer that question because they haven't been educated in that manner. So it's about educating them to where when I do say Black Lives Matter, they could say, oh, Black Lives Matter because X, Y, and Z. Remember what we learned? This is why they matter. And this is why we're proclaiming out loud in the streets, Black Lives Matter, because your actions have said they don't. And so just in case you didn't know, we're going to say it again. Yeah.
So good.
Okay. Quick thought. So I was one of my friends. His name's Kiwi. He's a rapper, originally from LA, been in Oakland for the last bunch of years. And he, you know, one thing he said a long time ago that's always stuck with me is he said, I think that when you grow up feeling inferior to some degree, that it can become that much more difficult to acknowledge the privileges that you do have, right? And so, for instance, like I think about, you know, men of color acknowledging the ways that we benefit from patriarchy because of the ways we felt inferior because of white supremacy. And I think about the Japanese American educator Scott Nakagawa, who he calls anti-Blackness the fulcrum of white supremacy, kind of like the lever, right? So he says that, you know, if and when, you know, all of us who you know, are doing our best to lead from a place of love can identify that, and the more that we can identify, combat, and ultimately destroy anti-Blackness, just the better things become for all people involved. And I think that when, you know, to be honest with young people, I've talked about that, and particularly while understanding there are some young people, non-Black young people of color who, you know, carry some real wounds and feelings of inferiority. And some of that, you know, could potentially be the root of why, you know, there's like such a defensive reaction around acknowledging Black Lives Matter. And so being able to remember that, like, you know, that like that young person needs to be pushed and supported, but also remembering like, you know, like Malcolm, for instance, like Detroit Red versus who he was to El-Haj Malik Shabazz at the end of his life, that like we have the capacity to change and grow and be better.
I appreciate that. I think something you said brought something up in me and I want to break this down to folks of like, but I am happy. I treat people kind. I have a Black friend. I have this. and they don't realize we all have work to do, including us three. Like we've done, I know you are all culturally responsive leaders in your own capacity, and you are still reflective. And that's what I love about you too. And I think about in my own learning and being a product of schooling here, right? From two immigrant parents that are like, just work hard, do this, do that. But like instilling an internal love of who I am and not realizing that some of my self-esteem is normal. And then some of the lack of self-esteem I had growing up was also because of my proximity to whiteness. For example, beauty. The closer you are to the whiteness piece, the small nose, the hair, the light skin, and it's colorism is real in Black and brown communities and Asian communities too, I would say. The closer you are to whiteness, the more winning you are. Like talk white, look white, act white. And I think we're decentering that, and not by saying, well, then are we going to act Black? Are we going to, it's not that. It's saying, one, we've been historically sending implicit messages that you're not beautiful enough, that you're not smart enough, that you don't sound smart enough. And you internalize that and you get sick. And part of that is like, what do I love about myself? And the parts that I don't love, how did I learn to not love that? Like, why? And what is my metric of beauty, of intelligence, of leadership even, which is why so many people of color have like an imposter syndrome when they get to certain points or college. And I think about you talking about race with your child is so important, not just kindness, but together, because we are trying to create a world where we see each other, where we are creating a foundation. And the Native Americans, indigenous folks, had something called the 7th generation rule. Whatever we do right now, we have to think about my actions right now. How is it going to affect our world 7 generations from now? If I kill this tree, how is it going to affect 7 generations from now? How did we move so far away from the future to like our own comfortability right now, instead of like, what world are we leaving our kids? Right? And I appreciate if you don't know how to have that conversation, there are so many books out there that you can start the conversation. And I love that. And I'm going to end with a question for you that I want you to think about. What does it mean to be an anti-racist leader or educator? Like, what does that mean? And I want, because I think, Colin, you said it, it's not just like you're going to create a solution. You're going to create a DEI council. You're going to hire more Black and brown folks. You're going to whatever. It's what does it mean to be an anti-racist leader? And whoever's listening to this, you're a parent, you're a high school student, you're a senior leader in an organization. I want them to take this and say, understand what it means to be an anti-racist leader. And it's not about, I did all these things. So what does it mean to you to be an anti-racist leader or educator?
Oh, Jesus.
That's a deep question.
Right? I think the one first, it means to be critical. The question I'm constantly asking is like, who does this privilege? Who does this not privilege? And the moment you know who this, whatever system it is, who it doesn't privilege, like you need to analyze that system and change it, right? So I think it also means constantly adjusting, being willing to learn and to adjust for your students. I think it also means affirming and accepting folks that are other. So I know that a lot of the anti-racist conversation has been centered on Black folks, and I appreciate that because there's a lot of hope in that for me. And I also know that Ibram Kendi says, like, you cannot be anti-racist and not be for trans folks. Like, you cannot be anti-racist and not be for, like, oh, I'm just like Black. I'm all about Black Lives Matter, but not if your life happens to fit this, right? I think it also means making sure, I think about at the elementary level, students see themselves in what they're learning. they see their real experiences, and that you engage in discomfort all of the time. So you don't shy away because you're like, how am I supposed to navigate this lesson for this child? They're already navigating it literally in their life. You do it anyways when it becomes uncomfortable. And I think it also means showing up, like showing up the way your families and your kids need you to show up. So when George Floyd passed, like I knew my Black families needed me to say like, Black lives matter and this is where we stand and we are mourning with you, right? And if I wasn't in a position as a leader to do that, because everyone's on a different equity journey, because I don't want this performative mess, like, let me just declare Black lives matter. If I am currently like entering this journey and I'm not sure what it means to say Black lives matter and I don't know how to show up, then it means educating myself, right? Educating my staff and having real conversations around how we may be a part of these systems that are unintentionally, because I don't believe anyone in schools is doing it on purpose. I hope not, right? Unintentionally like oppressing children and oppressing our community. I think it also means like when you make a mistake, being willing to have that conversation, because this work is not easy. And so I'd say anti-racism work is going to be a journey for everyone. No one is ever going to be, I'm there. Like I'm an anti-racist leader. I have no more learning to do. You have to be committed to learning and adjusting.
That was beautiful. I don't really know how much I can really add. I guess the thought that's coming to mind is one of my colleagues of many years, restorative practices coordinator at my school, Ms. Trish, made brilliant Black mother from Oakland, educator for so many years. But she says, show me somebody who's done growing, and I'll show you someone who's dead and in the ground, right? And I think that like it begins with this perpetual wanting to learn. I imagine, and I imagine at times I've been this person, but I think that some of the most challenging people to work in community with around anti-racist practice are the ones who believe they've arrived, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and think that they have like no more learning to do or that they get it. And I think that any time that we are operating from that place, like, or it's like, it's harmful. And so I think being able to, Taquita, like you said, like be able and willing to make mistakes and understand that like mistakes are like, just like human and going to happen, but like also necessary in this work, but also this this really important element of being able to acknowledge the mistakes and do our best to not repeat them. The friend said the best apology is a change in behavior, right? And so also like changing our behavior, and I think like the last two thoughts are, one is that like one of my mentors, and probably the reason why I got into teaching, Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, he, one thing he's super solidified in my mind and my practice is that when we talk about oppression, when we talk about white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, that it's so crucial and important to focus on the resistance to it and the ways that communities come together and have resisted, and have that be the focus so that you're not unintentionally leading young people into despair or paralysis. That focus on the resistance and the like fighting for humanization to be recognized is what can produce, what Cornel West calls critical hope. That isn't like fake, like hokey hope or, things like that. And I'm forgetting the last thing that I was going to say, but yeah, I think that's good.
That's so good. I mean, if it comes to you, were you going to say something, Taquita?
Yeah, you made me think in your last statement around one of the things we really want to focus on in SCL this year is like healing and advocacy. So we're introducing these really serious topics to children, elementary age children, right? So how do we teach them to heal, and how do we teach them to advocate for themselves as a form of, also in a resistance as a form of advocacy, right? Because that can also help with healing. And so I'm really happy you brought that up, because we can't disregard the fact that these conversations are really difficult for adults and for children. And so we have to make sure that we're giving them the tools they need to be able to engage in that critical hope. So I'm really happy you brought that up.
I think I just remember what I was going to say, and it's really tied to this. I'm thinking about like the mood meter, for instance, and like, because I think that, you know, something that maybe folks who are, you know, kind of in this moment coming to this place of like, I want to start learning more about anti-racist work, and I want to, you know, come into this, but also I think are feeling shame around like, I'm just like new to this and feeling like, you know, like shame around that. Is something that I tend to notice even within like, you know, my school community and just like every place I've ever worked, even within myself at times, is like that I think when we're naming our emotions and identifying emotions, there's a way that dominant culture really, you know, views certain emotions as like good and some as bad. And I think some of the brilliance in SEO is like being able to name that like emotions just are what they are. And you know, inadvertently, you know, pushes back a little bit against white supremacy culture, in that it's like not saying you have to be in the yellow and high energy and high pleasantness, and that's the only time that things are good, right? And I think that the more that, you know, those of us in this work, you know, doing our best to, you know, imperfectly figure things out, like I think that's like kind of the trend that I notice, is that, you know, whether consciously or not, the vast majority of folks that I, you know, have done this work with and felt really held by and supported and pushed have been those who recognize emotions as just what they are, and like, and how important it is to acknowledge, you know, label them, understand them, recognize them, but don't view like, you know, one emotion as superior to others.
I appreciate that.
I think there's a lot of joy in that and hope in that.
Yeah, recognizing that all emotions are like important and they're necessary. I really appreciate that reminder. I want to close with, well, one, I want people to know one of my personal values is rooted in love, like loving others, loving self, loving love. Like I truly do believe that. And it's been a growth for me over time, right? And a lot, so this conversation may have brought cathartic feelings in you, like angry, guilt, you know, all this. And I always close with like, you are enough. Like, you are enough. Your job is hard. And sometimes you first have to process and reflect on your own before you can hold a space for your kids and still hold the space and start the conversation somewhere. Right. And I want to bring in two principles, Ubuntu and Inlakesh. Ubuntu comes from African descent. Inlakesh comes from Mayan descent. And Ubuntu is pretty much saying, I am because we are. And Inlakesh is, tú eres mi otro mí, right? And when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's saying, I cannot rest unless all of us have the same access, the same opportunities, are healed, are feeling safe, because you're concerned. You want to make sure. Right now, our most vulnerable populations in this country, like, we can't ignore them, right? We can't ignore that this is happening, or that is historically has happened. And Ubuntu and Inlakesh, for folks of color who come from those two descents, it's really about loving another human being like you would love yourself, respecting another person's family like you would respect and want that respect for you, right? And so it transcends, like, this has been a message we've been hearing our whole life. And it's been in different cultures in different ways. Why wouldn't we transfer this to say, Black people have been hurt in this country? There needs to be some healing, and we need to do something about it. And that's not saying it's more important than immigrant children. It's more important than kids getting locked up. Like, it's just saying right now that as a collective, we're rallying around that. And it's going to inadvertently help other policies as well. It's going to help us improve as a nation and leave a country that we're proud of to our 7 generations after, right? So if you haven't started this, now's the time. And if you need book ideas, send me a message. We can go over books that you can probably start with, but you can probably YouTube it, Google it. There's things out there. Children's books where you can start the conversation. But remember, families, you are enough. We appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Taquita. This was such a great conversation. I mean, we can have it for hours. I hope you all learned at least one thing today, parents. If you walked away with one thing, then I did my job. Thank you once again, and see you next time. Bye.